History of papyrus. The material Egypt made illegal to export passed unlocked. A blank scroll of papyrus sat sealed in an Egyptian tomb for roughly 5,000 years before anyone unrolled it. Egyptian embalmers routinely stuffed dead strangers' burial masks with somebody else's old tax returns. A Roman poet once joked that the cheapest grade of papyrus was good for exactly one thing: wrapping fish. A king in the 2nd century BCE was so afraid of losing a library contest that he made it illegal to sell his own country's most valuable export to a rival monarch. And somewhere in Naples right now, a stack of scrolls that were burned solid by the eruption that buried Pompeii is being read for the first time in almost 2,000 years. Not by unrolling them, which would turn them to ash, but by a machine learning algorithm trained to see ink through carbon. For most of the ancient world, writing anything down that needed to travel, survive being read years later, or reach more than one person, came down to a single, fragile, geographically limited plant, one that grew reliably in commercial quantity in almost no other place on Earth. So how did a reed that only grew wild in one river delta become the operating system of the ancient Mediterranean, and the object at the center of what may be history's first recorded case of a government weaponizing a writing material against a rival? This is a history of papyrus. It is where the English word paper comes from, even though the two materials are made almost nothing alike and share no direct manufacturing lineage at all. For roughly 3,000 years, it was the medium that carried Egyptian tax records, Greek philosophy, Roman contracts, and Christian scripture. And almost nobody who used it stopped to think about where it came from, who controlled its supply, or what it took to make a single usable sheet. Behind it sit four forces most people never connect to a writing surface: the rise of large-scale government bureaucracy, the economics of international trade and monopoly, the preservation of religion and literature, and the sheer competitive hunger for knowledge that drove ancient states to go to genuinely strange lengths to control it. This is Past Unlocked, and this is the story of how Egypt turned a swamp weed into the ancient world's most valuable trade secret. Cyprus papyrus grew wild and thick along the marshy edges of the Nile Delta, sometimes reaching 12 to 15 feet tall. And Egyptians were already using it for almost everything else long before anyone thought to write on it. They wove its stalks into small boats, light enough to chase birds through the reeds. They twisted it into rope, plaited it into sandals, and ate the soft inner pith raw or roasted as a starchy snack. Writing on it came later, and only after someone worked out how to turn a round, fibrous stalk into something flat. The process, described in the most detail by the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder around 77 CE, started with a green stalk cut into sections roughly 1.5 feet long. The tough outer rind was peeled away, and the soft pith underneath was sliced into thin strips. One layer went down lengthwise, a second layer went on top, crosswise. The whole sheet was pressed or beaten until the plant's own natural sugars glued the two layers into one, then left to dry in the sun. The marshes that grew it best were not open common land. Either by the Ptolemaic period, papyrus swamps along the delta were classified as crown property, harvested under royal supervision, and processed in state-linked workshops before a single sheet ever reached a private buyer. An early working example of a government controlling a natural resource from the ground up, long before supply chain was a phrase anyone needed. Once Egypt had a reliable way to mass-produce that sheet under exactly this kind of control, the plant stopped being a purely local resource. Phoenician traders operating out of the port of Byblos, on what is now the coast of Lebanon, were shipping Egyptian papyrus across the Mediterranean by the 12th century BCE, in quantities large enough that the Greeks simply started calling the material Byblos after the port it came through. That word became Byblos, then Biblion, meaning book, and eventually Biblia, the plural the earliest Christians used for the collection of texts now known as the Bible. Greece adopted the material wholesale for its own emerging literary culture. Rome, once its territory swallowed the eastern Mediterranean, became the largest single consumer papyrus would ever have. Jewish communities across the eastern Mediterranean adopted it for religious and legal texts. Early Christian communities, a few centuries later, would write their gospels and letters on it too, in the codex format rather than the scroll, well before parchment became the default material for a Bible. Meanwhile, along the Red Sea and down into Nubia, Egyptian administrative and religious influence carried papyrus use southward wherever Egyptian-trained scribes went, though never at anything close to the scale seen along the Mediterranean coast. Mesopotamia, by contrast, kept writing on clay. Cuneiform tablets did not rot, did not tear, and did not require importing a plant that refused to grow anywhere near the Tigris or Euphrates, but they were heavy, slow to inscribe in bulk, and useless for anything that needed to travel fast. Papyrus was the opposite on every count. Light, quick to write on, easy to roll up and carry 1,000 miles by ship. It also had one weakness clay never had. Outside of Egypt's bone-dry climate, it rotted. Egyptians had been growing, harvesting, and using papyrus in some form since at least the 4th millennium BCE, long before anyone used it to record a single word. The oldest surviving papyrus object in existence is not a document at all. It is a blank roll, undecorated and unused, buried around 2900 BCE in the tomb of a court official named Hemaka at Saqqara. Nobody knows exactly when Egyptians first pressed pith into a writable sheet, only that by the time of Hemaka's burial, papyrus already existed as a finished product, standardized enough to be worth placing in a tomb alongside a man's other valued possessions. The oldest surviving papyrus with actual writing on it comes from more than 3 centuries later. A set of logbooks kept by a minor official named Merer, dated to the reign of King Khufu around 2560 BCE, recording the shipment of limestone for the Great Pyramid. Between those two objects sits the real gap this story runs on: the centuries it took a useful plant to become a writing technology at all, and the additional centuries after that before writing itself became something an entire government could not function without. A blank scroll in a tomb and a shipping ledger for a pyramid are separated by roughly the same span of time that separates today from the early Roman Empire. Whatever process turned reed pith into a reliable writing surface, it was not solved overnight, and no single inventor's name survives attached to it. By the height of the New Kingdom, and especially under the Greek-ruled Ptolemaic dynasty that followed Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BCE, papyrus production had scaled into a full-state industry, harvested, processed, and exported under close royal oversight, because the plant that made it possible grew almost nowhere else in the ancient Mediterranean world in commercially useful quantity. Rome, Greece, and the cities of the Levant all depended on Egyptian supply chains for their writing material, year after year, with no serious rival source. Babylon and the cities of Mesopotamia, by contrast, never made the same switch at scale. Papyrus could be imported there too, but at a steep markup, over land and sea, competing against a domestic clay tablet tradition that was already centuries old and required no foreign trade route at all. Egypt did not just grow the ancient world's paper. Across most of antiquity, it was functionally the only company town in the business. The Library of Alexandria, founded under the early Ptolemies in the early 3rd century BCE, is the clearest illustration of what that near monopoly could build once one government controlled both the raw material and the ambition to use it. Ancient sources claim its holdings ran anywhere from around 200,000 to nearly 700,000 scrolls. Figures modern historians treat with real skepticism, since no ancient library catalog that detailed survives to confirm either number. Whatever the true count, no other Mediterranean library came remotely close, and no library outside Egypt could have, given that every scroll on those shelves depended on a plant that, as far as anyone in the 3rd century BCE knew, grew properly nowhere else on Earth. That monopoly turned into a weapon in the 2nd century BCE in a rivalry between two kings who never met in battle and fought their entire war in ink. Eumenes II ruled Pergamon, a wealthy Greek kingdom in Asia Minor, from 197 to 159 BCE, and he wanted a royal library that could compete with the most famous one in the world, the Library of Alexandria, in the Ptolemaic capital that had spent generations collecting, copying, and hoarding scrolls. According to the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, citing the earlier scholar Varro, the Ptolemaic king grew alarmed enough at Pergamon's ambitions that he banned the export of papyrus outright, cutting off the one material Eumenes needed to fill his shelves. Which king exactly gave that order is not stated with certainty in the surviving text. The timing points most plausibly to Ptolemy V Epiphanes, but the strategy itself is clear enough. Strangle a rival's library by strangling its supply chain. It did not work, or at least not the way it was intended to. Pliny's account says Pergamon responded by developing parchment, a writing material made from treated animal skin, as a substitute, and did it well enough that the material's Latin name, Pergamena, still preserves Pergamon's own name inside it. Historians today are skeptical that Pergamon actually invented parchment from scratch, since scraped and treated animal hides had already been used for writing in the region well before this rivalry began. The more likely story is that a papyrus shortage pushed Pergamon to expand and refine a technique that already existed. Either way, an Egyptian export ban aimed at protecting one library's advantage ended up helping build the writing material that would eventually outlast papyrus almost everywhere outside Egypt, which is, at minimum, a strange return on a trade embargo. The library Egypt was so determined to protect was not exactly playing fair either. Alexandria's own collecting policy, according to later ancient sources, included a standing order to search every ship that docked in its harbor for scrolls, copy anything on board the library did not already own, and, in some accounts, keep the original and hand the owner back a copy instead. A monopoly on the raw material and a willingness to seize the finished product were, apparently, two sides of the same strategy. Alexandria did not just want more books than everyone else, it wanted to be the only place capable of producing them at scale. Eumenes and the Ptolemies were not just library rivals, either. Pergamon and Egypt had spent decades maneuvering against and alongside each other in the wider Hellenistic power struggles that followed the breakup of Alexander the Great's empire, jockeying for influence over the same stretch of the Eastern Mediterranean. A library was prestige. It was also, in a world where written record-keeping underpinned diplomacy, law, and administration, a soft power asset worth protecting, the same way a modern state protects a strategic industry. Not every sheet of papyrus was destined for literature or law. Pliny's Natural History lists a full hierarchy of papyrus grades by quality, from the finest hieratica, once reserved for religious texts before Roman flattery renamed the top grade after the Emperor Augustus, down through several mid-tier grades named for the towns that produced them. At the very bottom sat a grade called Emporitica, named for the merchants who bought it, not for its writing quality, because it had none. It was too rough and fibrous to take ink cleanly, so it was sold instead as wrapping material. Roman poets turned that fact into a running insult. A bad poem, in the literary slang of the day, was fit for nothing better than wrapping fish or spices at the market stall, the ancient equivalent of saying someone's writing belonged in the recycling bin. Except the bin in this case smelled like a fish market, and the paper was, technically, still papyrus. Even papyrus that had already been written on rarely went to waste. Egyptian workshops that prepared mummies routinely built the rigid outer casing, known as cartonnage, out of layers of old, discarded papyrus, pasted together, plastered, and painted over. Tax records, worn-out contracts, obsolete letters, and copies of literary texts nobody wanted anymore all ended up glued into a dead stranger's burial mask. That habit turned out to be an accidental gift to modern historians. Cartonnage recovered from mummies and mummy masks has yielded fragments of Homer's Iliad, portions of a lost Euripides play, and pages of Plato that exist nowhere else. Meaning some of the most famous literature to survive from the ancient world only survives because it was, quite literally, thrown away. By the early 4th century CE, papyrus had been the backbone of Roman record-keeping for so long that the empire finally tried to bring order to what had become a chaotic, regionally inconsistent market. Decades of debased coinage and military spending had driven prices across the empire into a genuine inflationary spiral, and in 301 CE, the Emperor Diocletian responded with his Edict on Maximum Prices, an empire-wide attempt to control that runaway inflation by fixing hard ceilings on the cost of goods and services, from grain and wine to skilled labor and long-distance shipping rates. Papyrus was on that list, priced by grade, the same rough hierarchy Pliny had described 2 centuries earlier, now written directly into imperial law. For the first time, a single administration spanning most of the known Mediterranean world was setting one standardized price structure for the material that ran its own bureaucracy, an empire regulating, by decree, the cost of the paper it used to regulate everything else. Papyrus had a real weakness, and it showed up the moment anyone tried to use it the way modern paper gets used. Cracks. Papyrus cracks. Fold a sheet more than once or twice, and the horizontal fibers snap cleanly along the fold, which is exactly why Egyptian, Greek, and Roman scribes almost never folded it at all. They rolled it instead into scrolls, sometimes joined end to end into rolls over 30 feet long, because rolling put far less stress on the fibers than folding ever could. Moisture was the other enemy. Damp air warped the sheets and invited insects, so scribes and librarians in the ancient world are recorded rubbing finished scrolls with cedar oil, a treatment believed to repel the worms that would otherwise eat straight through a library. A 30-foot scroll solved the cracking problem and created a smaller one of its own. Finding a single passage inside a rolled text meant physically unrolling it, section by section, with both hands, then rolling it back up again when finished. Workable for reading start to finish, tedious for looking anything up. That inconvenience is part of why, centuries later, Christian communities were early and enthusiastic adopters of the bound codex format. Sheets stacked and stitched down one edge like a modern book, even while they were still writing on ordinary papyrus rather than parchment. The material stayed the same. The shape holding it together changed, because scrolling back and forth through 30 feet of reed pulp every single time was never going to be anyone's favorite part of the job. None of that would have mattered much if papyrus had stayed a convenience for scholars and priests. What made it indispensable was the growth of something else entirely. Large, centralized, tax-collecting, contract-enforcing government. Ptolemaic and then Roman Egypt ran on paperwork. Land surveys, tax receipts, court petitions, marriage contracts, military pay records, generated in volumes that no stone inscription or clay tablet could have kept pace with. A single administrative district might produce thousands of individual documents in a single year. Stone was permanent but agonizingly slow to carve and impossible to file away by the ton. Clay was cheap but heavy, bulky, and, outside Mesopotamia's own scribal tradition, unfamiliar. Only papyrus checked every box at once. Light enough to store by the crate, cheap enough to use for a receipt as easily as a religious text, and fast enough to write on that a scribe could process dozens of transactions in a single day. Once a government reached the size and complexity that Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt had, papyrus stopped being a nicer option. It became the only option that could keep the state running at all. Just how much paperwork that actually meant did not become fully clear until 1896, when the British archaeologists Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt started digging through what was, quite literally, an ancient garbage dump outside the Egyptian town of Oxyrhynchus. Over the next 11 years, they pulled roughly 500,000 papyrus fragments out of a rubbish mound that had been accumulating for close to 1,000 years, from the 3rd century BCE through the Arab conquest in the 7th century CE. Most of it was exactly what you would expect a government to throw away: tax assessments, court filings, private letters, shopping lists, school exercises. Buried among the debris were also fragments of lost plays, unknown poems, and early Christian texts, preserved by accident in the one substance ancient Egyptians discarded by the ton and never imagined anyone would dig back up. Here's what most people don't realize about a plant most of them have never seen growing in the wild. Papyrus wasn't just a writing surface, it was infrastructure, in the same sense that roads and aqueducts were infrastructure. A piece of physical technology that a government's ability to function actually depended on. Take papyrus away from Ptolemaic or Roman Egypt, and the tax system stalls. Court cases go unrecorded. Army pay rosters disappear. And the largest library the ancient world had ever built stops being able to grow. This was not a hypothetical risk. Every disruption to the Delta harvest, whether from war, flooding, or simple mismanagement, sent ripples through every literate institution around the Mediterranean that depended on Egyptian supply and had no local alternative to fall back on. And the fight over that dependency, the export ban aimed at a rival king's shelves, may be the earliest documented instance in history of a state consciously using a monopoly on a communication medium as a geopolitical weapon. A playbook governments have reached for again and again in the centuries since, against newer materials and technologies, but built on exactly the same logic Ptolemaic Egypt worked out first. Control the medium, and you control who gets to speak and who gets remembered. Fast forward to the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, the same disaster that buried Pompeii, a few miles away. In the seaside town of Herculaneum, a private library of papyrus scrolls was buried under volcanic material so hot it carbonized the scrolls into solid black cylinders. Burned, but not destroyed, and sealed shut by the very heat that ruined them. Excavators dug hundreds of them out of the ground starting in the 1750s, and for close to 270 years, almost none of them could be read, because physically unrolling a carbonized scroll shatters it into fragments. Fast forward again to March 2023. A pair of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross, partnered with computer scientist Brent Seals to launch something called the Vesuvius Challenge, releasing high-resolution X-ray scans of several unopened Herculaneum scrolls to the public and daring programmers around the world to read them without ever physically touching them. In October 2023, a University of Nebraska-Lincoln student named Luke Ferreter trained a machine learning model to detect the faintest textural differences between carbonized ink and carbonized papyrus, and became the first person in almost 2,000 years to read a full word from inside one of the scrolls. Porphyrus, the ancient Greek word for purple. Teams have kept working the scrolls in the years since, recovering enough continuous text to identify entire previously unknown passages of ancient philosophy. Most of it so far pointing to Epicurean texts nobody alive had ever read. Of the many hundreds of scrolls recovered from that one villa in Herculaneum, Only a handful have been meaningfully read in full, and archaeologists suspect the villa's main library, wherever it is, has not even been excavated yet. Why does an algorithm trained to spot ink under carbon feel like it belongs in the same story as a Ptolemaic export ban? Because both are the same fight, fought with whatever tools a given century has available. A persistent, ongoing effort to get information out from wherever it happens to be trapped. Underneath the reed boats, the export bans, the cedar oil, and the machine learning models, humanity has never really stopped working on one single problem: how to make a thought outlive the person who had it. Papyrus answers the first half of that problem and quietly confesses to the second half's failure. Outside Egypt's dry sand and the freak accident of Herculaneum's volcanic seal, papyrus rotted, and it took most of what was written on it down with it. Classicists who have tried to measure the damage, comparing surviving texts against the titles and authors referenced by other ancient writers, commonly land on a figure near 1%, meaning roughly 99 out of every 100 works known to have existed in the Greek and Roman world are gone completely. Not damaged, not partial, just gone. Papyrus preserved an empire's paperwork in astonishing volume. It did not preserve most of what that empire actually thought. The Herculaneum villa is a small, strange exception that proves the rule rather than breaking it. It survived only because a volcano happened to carbonize it instead of letting it rot the ordinary way. And even that lucky accident is incomplete. Most historians who have studied the site suspect its main library, likely far larger than the few hundred scrolls found so far, has never been excavated at all, still sealed somewhere beneath the modern town built on top of it. Which raises an obvious next question. What actually happened inside the Library of Alexandria, the largest single collection papyrus ever built? And how much of what supposedly burned there was already gone long before the fires everyone likes to blame? The popular version: one dramatic fire and centuries of knowledge gone in an afternoon, does not hold up well against what ancient sources actually say. And untangling it properly is a story for another episode. Let us know in the comments which one you'd want to see first. But the Library of Alexandria didn't burn. Every book on the shelf behind you, every document open on the screen in front of you right now, is a distant descendant of a swamp reed that only grew properly in one river valley on Earth. Harvested under royal guard, shipped out under royal permission, and occasionally banned outright when one government decided a rival knew too much. And in a storage facility in Naples, right now, there are still Herculaneum scrolls that have not been unrolled, not been scanned, not been read, carbonized, sealed, and waiting. The same way they've been waiting since the year 79 for someone or something to finally get the words out.